Episode 2 begins where we left off with Officer Zaleski. The kid has escaped, killing several guards in the process. Zaleski draws his gun in pursuit, only to accidentally fire on his own CO, and for us to find out it was all a figment of his imagination.
What's the matter with you?
This begs the question, can the kid control people's minds, like what he did to the mouse in Episode 1? Notice the cell doors and the fingerprints. I've never seen a prison which keeps the inmates' fingerprints on display like that, and if you recall in Episode 1, the kid got his fingerprints taken. Obviously this was a choice on the part of the director and the production designer, and it will be interesting to see if this leads to anything. After creepily watching the kid back in his cell, we see the opening titles which are filled with Stephen King references. I'm not going to get into too much detail about them since there are already countless videos out there explaining the titles, but I do want to spend a bit of time looking at this map. What excites me about this is Castle Rock's relation to other fictitious Stephen King towns, such as Derry and Little Tall Island featured in the miniseries The Storm of the Century. This means that we'll likely see references to characters and stories beyond that of Castle Rock proper. Take note of Augusta, where Alan Pangborn confronts Warden Porter at the Augusta Hilton later on in the episode. We're then given a brief history of Castle Rock, narrated by Warden Lacey, who committed suicide in Episode 1. He explains how the town has hit hard times and is following a plan, and that plan isn't God's. He asks if we remember the dog, a reference to Cujo, and the Strangler, a reference to Frank Dodd's character in The Dead Zone. We are then transported to a football game in 1961 where the Castle Rock Cougars play against the Angels, and it's no coincidence that they're playing against a literal force of good, an angel which slams into young Dale Lacey. Religion plays a huge role in this episode and likely the series. Lacey makes reference to the fall after they found that boy's body, indicating a connection to Stand By Me, which connects Castle Rock to Leanne Chambers, the wife of one of the villains from that book, and who we saw put to death in Episode 1. The school mascot, who's Dale's brother, commits suicide. Ironic that 57 years later, his brother would do the same thing. We're then treated to 3 jumps in time as Lacey shows how his house was involved in a series of gruesome deaths. The first, likely in 1941, due to the Time magazine featuring Hitler shown here. This issue is from April 14th, 1941. Take note also of the cigarettes, smoked roughly to the same length as that in Episode 1, and the dead body in the bathtub, conjuring images of The Shining, especially considering seconds ago we saw a manual typewriter, all of these being conscious choices by the production team. We then transition to what is likely the 1960s, based on the television and vintage beer cans. You can also see an ashtray with cigarettes, right next to a man who has died from carbon monoxide. The final period is 1991, where we see Dale Lacey leave, carrying the same lantern from Episode 1 along with the toolbox. He crosses the same railroad track, which is now plastered with a missing Henry Deaver poster, the same kind we saw Molly take out. Lacey ventures into Cell Block F, explaining to us that hell is raising some sort of, quote, raid on this town. He smokes a cigarette, waiting for a sign from God, and we can see the can with the butts is markedly less full than before. He says he's received a message from God, who instructs him on how to properly build a cage for something of great evil. An evil that is, perhaps, the kid. In present day, Henry visits Martha Lacey for information about the kid. He sneaks into Dale's study and uncovers a folder full of newspaper clippings highlighting strange events from Castle Rock's past. I flipped the first page over thinking it may contain some clues, but unfortunately it's just an article about a teen getting burned by hot oil while working as a cook at the Sizzler.
So where to?
Sizzler.
The other pages are references to Stand By Me, Cujo, and Leland Gaunt, the antagonist from Needful Things. Henry finds multiple calendars, all of them with the same biblical passage from Acts 16:33. This chapter tells the story of a jailer who asks the disciple Paul what he must do to be saved, in which Paul says, quote, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." This begs the question, did Dale believe what he was doing was right if it meant saving himself and his family? Is he fighting for a greater cause? Martha kicks Henry out after discovering he's Henry Deaver, the boy suspected of killing Reverend Deaver, who was the head of Martha's church back in '91. But before Henry leaves, he remarks on a lock leading into Dale's basement, a lock that is missing in Episode 1. What mysteries lie below we'll hopefully find out later. At the church, we're introduced to the current pastor who runs a prayer partner program with Shawshank. He calls on Jackie Torrance, whose name is oddly similar to Jack Torrance in The Shining. There's no sign of any relation, at least not yet. Henry questions the pastor about Dale's connection to the church. Dale wasn't a fan, rather,
I think he considered nature his chapel.
it leads me to believe that the forest will have a bigger role to play in the supernatural occurrences around Castle Rock. Zaleski questions the kid about what happened the night before, but justifies it to himself that it's brain fog from lack of sleep due to the new baby on the way. At a hotel bar in Augusta, Alan confronts the warden and tells her a story about Dale, who apparently discovered the mystery of Castle Rock. To her surprise, Alan knows about the kid and implies that he's the devil, stating,
Don't let that kid out.
back in the water tank, Warden Porter uncovers a gross box of fingernails and a pair of scissors. Reeves decides to fix the kid problem by bunking him in with a skinhead. He's reading William Golding's Lord of the Flies, a story about a group of children who become savage and kill each other. Remember also the fly who hung around the kid in episode 1 and was found in Zaleski's coffee. This scene between Henry and Ruth is interesting because Ruth's memory seems to be pretty good. She recalls events from Henry's past that he doesn't remember, an interesting and odd reversal from what we saw in episode 1. Remember the mysterious person watching Henry from next door? It's Molly Strand, who's wearing the questionable fashion choice of sunglasses indoors. It seems Molly and Henry knew each other as kids and that she may have a crush on him, judging from his journal, and the fact her sister later calls her a voyeur. But I don't think that's the case. We'll examine that a bit later. Young Molly watches as Henry's father takes him out at 2:15 in the morning. This is likely not the night of the disappearance, since it's not winter. Back in the present, we see Molly take a pill like in episode 1. Molly's sister tells her she's suffering from social anxiety, but Molly believes she's some sort of psychic with the ability to feel others' empathy. Could she possibly have something similar to John Coffey in The Green Mile, an ability to see and feel the pain of others? Molly tells her sister she forged her signature in order to get equity on their parents' home. The forging signature here could be a clue. Remember the Henry Deaver signatures Molly was writing over and over again as a child? Look at the difference in the signatures on the left and the right, and the ripped pages in the middle. Could she be trying to forge his signature? Back at Shawshank, the skinhead gets a little too close to the kid. The kid tells him, "You don't want to touch me," but it's ambiguous whether that's a threat or a warning. At the Mellow Tiger Bar, a bar featured in Needful Things, Jackie approaches Henry and asks him if the rumors about how his father died are true. She also makes reference to Nan's luncheonette, another Needful Things nod. When Zaleski enters, Henry remembers him from the prison and hands him a napkin with his phone number. Henry finds Alan digging up a neighborhood dog. Apparently, Ruth thinks it's still roaming around, and she asked Alan to check. Is he telling the truth, or is he digging it up for other reasons? Back in 1991, a detective questions Molly about Henry's disappearance. Molly says she doesn't know anything, but it's clear she's hiding something. When the detective leaves, we see her frozen breath, even though the breath of the other characters weren't visible. The only explanation I have for this is that she can feel Henry's pain out in the frozen weather. There is some sort of transference here. Could Molly be the reason Henry survived? In present day, Henry finds a white queen chess piece in the fridge. The devil was known to play people in games of chess, and the trailer has shown that there are also crimson chess pieces. Could Castle Rock be the location of a great game between the devil and God? Henry has a secret meeting with Zaleski, who tells him more about the kid. Henry says he'll file Habeus Corpus, also the name of this episode, which states that if someone is being unlawfully detained, they must be brought to court to determine if the detention is lawful. In order to do that, Zaleski would need to be deposed, which he won't do for fear of losing his job, and with a baby on the way, he's not willing to do that. Henry will then need proof that the prisoner exists. So the next day, he decides to join the pastor's prayer bus. At Shawshank, the body of the skinhead is wheeled out, dead, with no apparent cause of death. The guard says,
You sure he's dead? He was just lying there.
An autopsy is done on the body, and it's found to be riddled with metastatic cancer of the heart, liver, and lungs, which leads me to believe what exactly is the extent of the kid's powers. Zaleski brings the kid to Henry, as we hear Dale's voiceover explaining God told him to, quote, never again let the kid see the light of day. But this begs the question, if God told him not to let the kid out, how come he killed himself and told the kid to ask for Henry? Was he under the kid's control, or is this all part of some master plan? Henry yells at the kid, telling him he can be his lawyer, before quickly snapping a few pictures of him for evidence. We see the dog from episode 1 run through the forest and uncover Dale's decapitated head as the final shot of the episode reveals that Dale's voiceover was a letter to Alan Pangborn, a letter he sets on fire outside of Shawshank. This episode greatly expanded on the story and gave us a better sense of what the show's about while posing more questions than answered. What is the relationship between Alan and Dale? Is Alan the new defender of Castle Rock? And what role will Henry and the kid have to play in the future? We'll just have to stay tuned and unlock the mysteries together. Hey, I hope you liked this video. If you liked it and want me to continue doing more Castle Rock analysis, make sure to like and subscribe. The mysteries are getting bigger and bigger, and I look forward to solving them with you. Stay tuned for episode 3, coming out soon.